The Academy of Galactic Advancement was home to the brightest minds across the known universe. It was a place where young scholars from different species trained to become leaders, scientists, and strategists who would shape the future of interstellar civilization. Each year, Professor Xylar, a veteran of countless conflicts and an esteemed expert in combat strategy, designed a final exam that would push his students beyond their limits. His challenges were infamous, designed not only to test intellect, but to expose weaknesses, ensuring that only the most adaptable would pass. This year, his assignment was simple but profound: design a self-defense weapon capable of withstanding any attack. The parameters were deliberately vague. The professor wanted to see how the students interpreted the task. The best minds of various species sat in silence as they processed the challenge, their complex brains already calculating strategies. Some of them whispered among themselves, exchanging ideas in hushed voices. Others immediately turned to their data tablets, sketching preliminary blueprints. Louise West, the lone human in the academy, leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, his brow slightly furrowed. While the others around him buzzed with ideas, he remained still, deep in thought. He knew how this would play out. The others would follow predictable patterns. Some would build advanced weapons designed to overpower attackers. Others would focus on evasive technology, and a few would attempt to integrate biological enhancements to counter aggression before it began. None of them, Luis suspected, would consider what he had in mind. Professor Xylar observed his students from the front of the grand lecture hall. His piercing yellow eyes scanned each face, gauging reactions, measuring resolve. When his gaze fell upon Luis, he narrowed his reptilian eyes slightly. The human remained still, uncharacteristically quiet for someone who often engaged in debates about tactical theories. The professor knew Luis was different. Unlike the other students who had grown up in technologically superior civilizations, Luis came from a species that had evolved in one of the most hostile environments in the galaxy. Humans were adaptable, unpredictable, and, most importantly, problem solvers. The professor expected something unconventional from him. Luis finally moved, tapping a few notes onto his tablet before rising from his seat. As the other students busily scribbled calculations and projected holographic models of potential weapons, Luis walked to the Academy's vast workshop. The room was a technological marvel, filled with cutting-edge machinery that could fabricate nearly anything a student could imagine. 3D printers hummed softly, nanoforges glowed with energy, and gravity manipulation tools sat neatly in their stations, awaiting the hands of future innovators. Most of the students had already begun assembling materials, their focus on creating the most efficient means of destruction. Luis, however, had a different approach in mind. He walked past the energy weapons section, ignoring the high-powered railguns, plasma casters, and disruptor grenades. He stopped at a workbench lined with electromagnetic coils, shielding materials, and kinetic absorbers. That was where he began. The first step was designing the core of his idea. He needed a device capable of not only deflecting attacks but completely neutralizing them. The energy from an incoming assault couldn't simply be redirected. It had to be absorbed, dissipated, or even repurposed. Luis worked methodically, sketching rough designs before translating them into more precise schematics. He calculated the frequencies needed to destabilize various energy types, ensuring that his shield could counter everything from thermal blasts to kinetic projectiles. The first few prototypes failed spectacularly. One emitted a field too weak to stop even a simple pulse shot. Another overheated after a single test, melting the core components. But Luis was patient. He iterated, adjusting power levels, modifying the dispersal matrix, and reinforcing the core with adaptive nanomaterials. As the other students fine-tuned their offensive weaponry, Luis was perfecting something entirely different, something designed to stop violence, not encourage it. His work caught the attention of some of his peers. At first, they ignored him, assuming he was just struggling with the assignment. But as the days passed, whispers started circulating. "Have you seen what the human is working on?" a Zalorian student muttered to his companion, a tall bioluminescent creature from the Hydrex species. I heard he isn't making a weapon at all, the Hydrexian replied, his tentacle-like fingers flickering with curiosity. That can't be true, right? The professor said self-defense. That means we have to fight. Yet Luis continued, undeterred. His focus was absolute, his mind locked on the problem at hand. He ran calculations late into the night, testing different power configurations, adjusting the field density, and reinforcing the shield's lattice structure. The breakthrough came when he discovered a way to modulate the shield's frequency to match incoming attacks. By adjusting in real time, his shield wouldn't just absorb attacks, it would render them harmless. It was no longer just a protective barrier, it was the ultimate defense mechanism. By the final day before the demonstration, Luis had completed his project. The device was compact, no larger than a forearm bracer, sleek in design yet incredibly advanced in function. Unlike the bulky energy weapons scattered across the workshop, his shield required no aggressive output. It simply existed as an impenetrable defense. That evening, as he shut down his workstation and prepared to leave, Professor Xylar entered the workshop, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on Luis. He approached slowly, his towering form casting a long shadow across the floor. You have been working differently from the others, the professor said, his deep voice carrying an air of curiosity rather than criticism. No offense. No destruction, only defense. Do you truly believe this is the best way to protect oneself? Luis met the professor's gaze without hesitation. Yes, he said firmly. I don't need to win a fight if no fight can happen in the first place. Professor Xylar studied him for a long moment before nodding. We shall see if your theory holds. Luis watched as the professor left the workshop. He knew tomorrow's demonstration would be unlike any in the Academy's history. Every student would showcase their might, their ability to destroy. But Louise would prove that sometimes the greatest power wasn't in taking life, it was in protecting it. Luis arrived at the Academy's testing ground before sunrise, his shield device secured on his forearm. The facility was a vast expanse of reinforced terrain, designed to withstand the destructive capabilities of the galaxy's most advanced weaponry. The towering observation deck loomed above the battlefield, where professors and high-ranking officials would gather to assess each student's project. The demonstration was scheduled to begin in just a few hours, but Luis wanted to run one final test before the challenge commenced. He activated the shield, watching as the transparent energy field shimmered to life around his arm. The frequency stabilizers hummed softly, adjusting in real time as he simulated different forms of attacks through the test console. He had programmed the system to replicate various weapons his classmates had built: plasma bursts, kinetic strikes, high-frequency sonic disruptors. Each attack dissipated harmlessly upon contact with the shield. Luis exhaled slowly, nodding to himself. The shield was ready. But was he? A metallic voice interrupted his thoughts. Still making last-minute adjustments, human? Luis turned to see a tall, armored figure approaching. Ralvek, a Zalorian student, stood with his arms crossed, his crystalline skin reflecting the ambient light. He was one of the Academy's top combat students, having designed a high-plasma cannon rumored to be capable of breaching warship hulls. Luis deactivated his shield, sliding his hands into his pockets. Just making sure everything works, Rolvek smirked. A shield, huh? Bold move, but how do you expect to win if you can't attack? Luis shrugged. Winning isn't always about fighting. Rolvek chuckled, shaking his head. You really don't get it, do you? The Prophet's challenge is about survival. If you think defense alone will save you, you're in for a rough day. With that, Rolvek turned and strode away, his confidence unwavering. Luis watched him go, feeling the weight of the upcoming trial settle over him. He knew what his classmates thought, that his project was a gamble, that he was throwing away his chance at proving himself, but he had no intention of proving anything to them. His goal was much bigger than impressing his peers. As the sun rose over the academy, the observation deck filled with professors, strategists, and representatives from various factions across the galaxy. The academy's final trials weren't just for assessment, they were a spectacle, an opportunity for governments and military leaders to scout potential recruits. Luis had no doubt that every student had spent the past weeks designing weapons meant to showcase their ability to wreak destruction on a massive scale. One by one, the students were called forward to demonstrate their inventions. Ralvek was among the first, stepping onto the battlefield with his plasma cannon strapped to his back. He activated the weapon, and a high-energy pulse surged forward, obliterating the reinforced target in an instant. The crowd murmured in approval. Others followed, each presenting weapons deadlier than the last. Sonic disruptors capable of liquefying organic matter, particle accelerators designed to bypass traditional shielding, high-impact railguns that could shatter reinforced alloys. Luis remained silent, observing from the sidelines. He had expected nothing less. Everyone had designed instruments of destruction. That was the way things had always been. Then his name was called. He stepped onto the battlefield, his shield device strapped securely to his arm. A few of the other students exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. Even Professor Exlar raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Louise took a steady breath and activated the shield. A translucent energy field spread outward, wrapping around his body in a barely visible shimmer. He turned to the awaiting instructors. "I won't be attacking," Luis said, his voice calm. "I'll be defending." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Professor Exlar tilted his head slightly. "Then let's see how well your defense holds up." The first test was a standard projectile assault. The automated turrets activated, firing high-speed kinetic rounds toward him. Luis stood his ground. The bullets met the shield and dissolved into harmless particles before they could make impact. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. The second test escalated to energy weapons. Plasma bolts arced through the air, colliding with the shield. The energy field adjusted, absorbing and dispersing the impact with ease. Luis remained unmoved, watching as his shield neutralized each successive attack. Some of the instructors leaned forward, taking notes. Others whispered among themselves, intrigued by what they were witnessing. Then came the final test. Professor Exlar gestured toward the student section. "Any of you who wish to challenge Mr. West's defense may do so now." Ralvik stepped forward immediately, his plasma cannon primed. "Let's see if that thing can handle this," he muttered. He fired. A concentrated beam of plasma surged toward Luis. The shield flared, absorbing the energy, dispersing it harmlessly into the air. Ralvek's expression darkened. He adjusted his cannon, increasing the output. Another shot, this one far more powerful, launched forward. Again, the shield absorbed it without issue. Others joined in. Sonic disruptors, energy lances, concussive grenades. Each attack met the same fate. Luis did not move. He did not waver. He simply stood, his shield rendering every form of aggression powerless. By the time the last attack failed, a heavy silence filled the air. Luis deactivated the shield and looked toward Professor Exiar. "Survival isn't just about destroying your enemy," he said. "Sometimes the best way to win is to make sure no fight happens at all." For the first time that day, the professor smiled. Luis stood in the center of the testing grounds, his heart still steady despite the weight of dozens of eyes watching him. The last echoes of energy dissipated into the air, leaving a faint shimmer where his shield had absorbed the final attack. A charged silence settled over the arena as students, professors, and military observers processed what had just happened. The weapons designed to destroy, to tear through any defense, had proven utterly ineffective against the humans' invention. Ralvik clenched his fists, his crystalline skin darkening with frustration. His plasma cannon had been one of the most powerful offensive weapons at the academy, and yet it had done nothing. Other students exchanged wary glances, their once confident expressions now tinged with uncertainty. Some of them had mocked Luis for choosing defense over offense, but now they weren't so sure. Professor XLR took a step forward, the weight of his presence demanding attention. His reptilian features remained unreadable as he studied Luis with keen interest. He had seen countless battles, had witnessed civilizations rise and fall based on their ability to wield power. Yet never had he encountered a weapon that refused to fight back, and still triumphed. "Your shield is impressive," the professor finally said, his deep voice cutting through the tense silence. "But a test of defense is not complete without proving its limits. A weapon that cannot be broken is one that defies the laws of war." Lewis knew this was coming. He nodded once, standing his ground. Professor Exlar raised his hand, signaling toward a set of reinforced barriers lining the edges of the testing grounds. A low mechanical hum filled the air as a large containment field activated. From behind the barriers, a hulking automated combat droid emerged. Unlike the precision-based turrets or the handheld weapons of his classmates, this machine was built for destruction on a scale far beyond anything Louise had faced so far. It stood nearly 4 meters tall, its quadrupedal frame bristling with advanced artillery systems. Each of its limbs carried a different form of attack: high-frequency energy blades, ion cannons, pulse disruptors. Louise exhaled slowly. This was it. The real test. Without hesitation, the droid locked onto him. A warning alarm blared through the arena as the machine's targeting systems came online. Then, in a flash of movement, it struck. A concussive energy wave shot forward, distorting the air as it closed in on Luis's position. His shield flared to life, reacting instantly. The energy wave collided with the barrier, sending a cascade of harmless light rippling outward. Luis didn't flinch. The crowd murmured in astonishment. The droid recalibrated. Its next attack came faster, a series of high-velocity plasma rounds fired in rapid succession. Each impact was absorbed, the shield shifting in real time to compensate for the increased energy levels. The plasma's glow refracted harmlessly across the energy field before vanishing into nothingness. Luis's jaw tightened. The droid was analyzing his defense, searching for a weakness. He had built the shield to handle various forms of attack, but he had never tested it against an adaptive system. The machine adjusted again. This time it launched an electromagnetic pulse. The crowd gasped as a surge of power crackled through the air. If his shield had any vulnerability, it was now. For a split second, the energy barrier flickered. A gap formed, barely noticeable, but there. The droid seized the opportunity, firing a high-impact kinetic round directly at him. Lewis reacted instinctively. His hand moved to the control interface, manually recalibrating the frequency field before the projectile reached him. The shield surged back to full power just in time, dispersing the kinetic energy and leaving him unharmed. The moment was brief, but the professor saw it. His eyes narrowed. "Your shield has limits," he observed. Louise nodded. "Everything does." The droid switched strategies. Instead of singular high-powered attacks, it launched an unpredictable barrage: plasma, kinetic rounds, disruptor beams, all firing in seemingly random sequences. It was trying to overwhelm him, force his shield to expend more energy than it could sustain. Luis focused, adjusting the modulation in real time, countering each attack as efficiently as possible. The minutes stretched on. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Luis endured the onslaught, his shield absorbing everything the machine threw at him. Beads of sweat formed along his brow. His muscles ached from the strain of maintaining focus, his mind racing through calculations as he pushed his invention to its absolute limit. Then suddenly the droid powered down. A final blast of residual energy crackled before fading into nothing. The test was over. Louise was still standing. For a moment there was no sound. Then a slow, deliberate clap echoed through the arena. Professor Xylar. The applause was brief, but it was enough. Others joined in, hesitantly at first, then more confidently. The military observers in the stands exchanged unreadable glances. The students who had mocked Luis only days before now looked at him with something that resembled respect. Even Ralvek, though visibly frustrated, gave a begrudging nod. Luis deactivated the shield, letting out a slow breath. He had done it. Professor Exlar stepped forward once more. "Your shield has shown remarkable adaptability," he said. "It does not fight, yet it renders war meaningless. This is a concept unfamiliar to most civilizations." Luis met his gaze. "Maybe it's time they learned." The professor studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Perhaps." Luis turned to leave the testing grounds, but he could feel the weight of every gaze on him. He had come to the academy as an outsider, a human among species who had spent centuries perfecting the art of war. But today, he had proven something none of them had expected. He had changed the rules of battle. Luis left the testing grounds with his head held high, but he could still feel the weight of the moment pressing against his thoughts. He had won, if survival could be called victory. His shield had endured everything thrown at it, yet instead of triumph, a lingering uncertainty settled in his chest. He hadn't just demonstrated a new kind of technology, he had challenged an idea that had shaped civilizations for millennia, the belief that power was measured by destruction. As he walked through the academy's central corridor, whispers followed him. Students who had mocked him days before now spoke in hushed voices, their tones filled with curiosity, disbelief, and something else: concern. He had upended a fundamental truth they had been raised to believe. To them, strength had always meant weapons, force, and the ability to strike down an enemy before they could strike back. But Luis had proved that none of it mattered if war itself could be neutralized. His steps carried him toward the dormitories, where he planned to rest before the academy's formal evaluations the next day. But before he could reach his room, a familiar voice called out from behind. "Luis." He turned to see Professor Exlar standing at the far end of the hallway, his hands clasped behind his back. The usual sharpness in the professor's eyes was softened by something unreadable, perhaps curiosity, perhaps calculation. "Walk with me," the professor said. Luis hesitated for only a moment before falling into step beside him. They walked in silence through the academy's upper levels, the dim glow of the artificial skylights casting elongated shadows against the metallic walls. The corridors were quiet now, most students still gathered in the testing grounds or deep in discussion about the day's events. "I imagine you understand the impact of what you have done," the professor finally said. Luis exhaled. "I didn't do it to make a statement, I just built something that worked." The professor glanced at him, his reptilian features betraying no emotion. "You built something that defied the expectations of war. That is not a small thing, Luis West." Luis remained silent. They reached an observation deck overlooking the academy's training fields. From this height, Luis could see the remnants of the day's trials: scorched ground, shattered targets, and the remains of energy-dispersed debris. Every test before his own had left destruction in its wake. His was the only one that had changed nothing in the landscape, except the understanding of those who had watched it. The professor followed his gaze. "I have spent decades training students in the art of war, preparing them to fight, to conquer, to survive in a galaxy where weakness is not forgiven. And yet today, you stood before all of them and suggested, no, proved, that perhaps they have been learning the wrong lesson." Luis turned to face him fully. "You think I proved something?" The professor nodded. "You demonstrated that power does not have to be destructive, that perhaps survival is not about being the strongest, but about making strength unnecessary." Luis frowned. "Then why do I feel like no one sees it that way?" The professor let out a slow breath, his gaze still fixed on the battlefield below. "Because you have challenged a belief that has existed for thousands of years. One demonstration, no matter how impressive, will not erase that." Luis leaned against the railing. "So what now? Everyone forgets about it and goes back to designing bigger and better weapons." The professor studied him carefully before speaking. "That depends. Do you intend to let them forget?" Luis narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying?" Professor Exlar turned to face him fully, his posture as composed as ever. "The academy does not exist in isolation. It is a place where the future is shaped. Military leaders, engineers, strategists, all of them watch what happens here and take lessons back to their worlds. Some of them will see your shield as a tool to be exploited, others will see it as a threat, and some, his gaze darkened slightly, will see it as an inconvenience to be erased before it spreads too far. Luis felt a chill crawl down his spine. You think someone will try to stop me? The professor's silence was answer enough. Luis clenched his fists. He had built the shield as a way to protect, to ensure that wars could be fought without casualties, without endless cycles of retaliation. But he had failed to consider the most dangerous force in the galaxy, the unwillingness of those in power to change. Then, I can't just let it end here, Luis said finally. The professor inclined his head slightly. No, you cannot. Luis exhaled, looking down at the academy grounds again. He had thought his greatest challenge would be proving his shield could work, but now he saw the real battle was only beginning. The battle not against weapons, but against the minds that refused to imagine a future without them. Luis returned to his dormitory that evening, but sleep never came. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through everything Professor XLR had said. He had known his invention was different, but he had not expected it to shake the foundation of the Academy's teachings. Now, he understood that it wasn't just about proving his shield worked, it was about what it represented. A future without war. A future that those in power might not want to exist. The next morning, the Academy held its final evaluation. The students gathered in the grand hall, an enormous chamber with towering walls lined with banners representing the many civilizations that had sent their brightest minds to train there. The atmosphere was tense. The results of their demonstrations would determine their future. Who would be offered positions in military research, who would be selected by elite tactical units, and who would be left behind. Luis stood among them, his posture relaxed, but his mind was alert. He had no idea how the Academy would classify his project. He had not built a weapon. He had not devised a strategy to conquer or destroy. He had created something that made war itself obsolete. Would they see its value, or would they dismiss it as an anomaly? Professor Exlar stood at the front of the hall, addressing the gathered students. His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of authority. You have all demonstrated your understanding of warfare, strategy, and survival. Some of you have created weapons of great power. Some of you have shown tactical brilliance. But one among you has challenged the very concept of war itself. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Luis remained still, his expression unreadable. The professor continued. Louis West has presented a device that does not destroy, a shield that renders attacks meaningless. Some may question its usefulness in battle. Others may fear its implications. But the undeniable truth is this. His invention has changed the way we must think about conflict. For that reason, his work will not be ignored. A murmur of surprise passed through the room. Luis met the professor's gaze. There was no approval, no indulgent smile, only a look that said, "This is only the beginning." Then another voice rang out. And what happens when someone finds a way to break it? Luis turned toward the source. Ralvik stood near the back of the hall, his arms crossed. His expression was not one of anger, but of cold calculation. No defense is perfect, Ralvik said. Maybe today your shield held. But what happens when someone finds a way through it? What happens when the galaxy adapts? Louis knew this argument well. He had considered it himself. He stepped forward, his voice steady. Then we improve it. Just like weapons evolve, defense can evolve too. But if we spend all our time creating better ways to kill, we never stop the killing. If we focus on making war obsolete, then one day, maybe it will be. Ralvik scoffed. You think peace is that easy? Louis shook his head. I think peace is a choice, a hard one, but one worth making. Silence followed. The Academy had trained these students to think of war as inevitable, as something that could only be mastered but never ended. Now they were forced to confront a new idea, that maybe, just maybe, War was only inevitable because no one had ever tried hard enough to stop it. The evaluations continued, but Luis had already made his mark. By the end of the ceremony, his name was called among those selected for advanced research. But unlike the others who were placed into military innovation programs, his assignment was different. He was to lead a new division, one focused not on creating stronger weapons, but on developing technology that could prevent war before it started. As the students filed out of the hall, Professor Exiler approached him. "You have a long road ahead, Louise West," he said. "There will be those who resist, those who will see your work as a threat, but there will also be those who see its potential." Luis nodded. "I won't stop." The professor studied him for a moment before inclining his head slightly. "Then, perhaps, one day, neither will war." Luis left the academy that day knowing that he had done something far greater than build a shield. He had changed the conversation. He had planted the seed of an idea that could one day reshape the galaxy. Not with weapons, not with war, but with the possibility of something better.